When a lone B-17 flying fortress met 15 enemy fighters at 25,000 feet over Nazi-occupied Europe, what happened next would defy every calculation of survival. This is not a story of overwhelming firepower or numerical superiority. This is a story of 10 men, isolated in the freezing darkness of the stratosphere, facing an onslaught that should have torn them from the sky in minutes. February 20th, 1944. The skies above Brunswick, Germany. B-17G serial number 4231763, nicknamed Old Reliable of the 381st Bombardment Group, has become separated from its formation during one of the deadliest bombing campaigns of the war. Staff Sergeant Harold Fisher peers through his waist gun window and counts the dots materializing against the winter clouds. 15 German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, closing fast. The odds are impossible. The outcome seems certain. But in the next 30 minutes, something extraordinary will unfold at the edge of breathable atmosphere, a desperate aerial duel that will push men and machine beyond every conceivable limit. To understand the miracle that was about to occur, we must first understand the hell that American bomber crews faced every time they crossed into German airspace in early 1944. The strategic bombing campaign against the Third Reich had reached its most desperate phase. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging aircraft at an unsustainable rate, losing sometimes 50 bombers in a single mission. Young men were being thrown into combat with life expectancies measured in weeks, not months. The B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name through sheer punishment, absorbing capability. Bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns, armored with strategic plating, built to take catastrophic damage while remaining airborne, it was America's answer to the fortress cities of Nazi Germany. But even the mighty fortress had its limits, and those limits were tested daily in the frozen killing fields above Europe. Old Reliable's crew represented a cross-section of American resolve. 25-year-old Captain Robert Morrison commanded from the pilot's seat, a farm boy from Iowa, with 32 missions under his belt, just 3 away from completing his tour and going home. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James Kellerman, was on his 8th mission, still learning the deadly choreography of formation flying while under constant attack. Behind them, Bombardier First Lieutenant Thomas Hendricks occupied the notorious nose position, surrounded by plexiglass, exposed to frontal attacks with only his twin guns for protection. The waist gunner Staff Sergeant Harold Fisher and Staff Sergeant Raymond Pritchard stood at their posts amidships, their guns pointed perpendicular to the fuselage, waiting for the beam attacks that could cut a fortress in half. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano manned the top turret, swiveling his twin 50s in the clear bubble above the cockpit. Staff Sergeant Patrick Sullivan crouched in the cramped ball turret beneath the aircraft, suspended in a sphere of plexiglass and steel, the most vulnerable and isolated position on the entire aircraft. In the tail, separated from his crewmates by the entire length of the fuselage, Staff Sergeant William Bill Jennings occupied what many considered the most important defensive position on the bomber. Tail gunners were the last line of defense against the 6 o'clock attacks that German pilots preferred, coming from behind and below, targeting the fortress's engines and fuel tanks. Jennings had shot down 2 fighters in previous missions. Today, that number would multiply dramatically. The navigator, Second Lieutenant David Klein, worked at a small table behind the cockpit, calculating position, fuel consumption, and the increasingly desperate routes back to England. Radio operator Technical Sergeant George Lawson monitored frequencies, listening for recall orders or distress calls from other aircraft in the formation, his equipment crackling with the chaos of aerial combat. Their mission that morning had begun routinely enough, if any mission into the heart of Germany could be called routine. The 381st Bombardment Group had launched from Ridgewell, England, at 0630 hours as part of a massive strike force targeting aircraft manufacturing facilities in Brunswick. More than 300 bombers had taken off into the pre-dawn darkness, forming up over the English countryside before turning east toward the continent. The formation had crossed into German airspace at 0845 hours, climbing to 25,000 feet, an altitude chosen to stay above most anti-aircraft fire, while remaining in breathable atmosphere for the crew. At this height, the outside temperature hovered at 40 degrees below zero. The men wore electrically heated suits, but equipment failures were common, and frostbite was a constant threat. Everything had gone according to plan until the approach to the target. It's when the Luftwaffe hit them with everything they had. The German fighter forces defending Brunswick that day represented some of the most experienced and battle-hardened pilots remaining in the Luftwaffe. By February 1944, the air war over Germany had become a brutal calculus of attrition. The Germans were losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. But the survivors were veterans of hundreds of combat missions, men who had perfected the art of killing bombers. The initial attack came from above Messerschmitt 109s, diving through the formation with cannons blazing. The noise was deafening, even through the insulated helmets the crew wore. The 50 caliber guns opened up across the formation, filling the air with tracer fire that looked like deadly fireflies in the thin sunlight. B-17s began falling out of formation, some exploding instantly as cannon shells found fuel tanks or bomb loads, others spiraling down trailing smoke and flame, tiny figures tumbling from escape hatches as crews bailed out over enemy territory. Captain Morrison held Old Reliable steady in the formation, fighting the controls as German shells punched through the wings and fuselage. The bomber shuddered with each impact, but the engines continued their steady roar. Romano in the top turret swung his guns toward a Focke-Wulf 190, making a head-on pass, the most terrifying attack vector a bomber crew could face. At closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, there was no time for error. The German fighter grew from a dot to a menacing silhouette in less than 2 seconds, its wing-mounted cannons sparking. Romano's tracers found their mark. The FW-190 broke off, trailing smoke, but 3 more took its place. In the nose, Lieutenant Hendricks fired controlled bursts at the attacking fighters, his breath coming in short gasps as the oxygen system struggled to keep up with his racing heart. One of the 109s pressed its attack too close, and Hendricks had a momentary, terrifying glimpse of the German pilot's face, young, determined, focused before the fighter broke away, its propeller only feet from Old Reliable's nose. Then came the moment that changed everything. A string of cannon shells, probably 20 millimeters from AFW-190, walked across the formation, stitching destruction across 3 bombers. Old Reliable took hits in the number 3 engine and the left horizontal stabilizer. The bomber lurched violently as the engine coughed, sputtered, and died, the propeller windmilling uselessly. Morrison feathered the engine to prevent it from tearing loose, while Kellerman worked the trim tabs to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. But that wasn't the worst of it. The hits to the stabilizer had damaged the hydraulic lines controlling the autopilot. Morrison felt the controls go mushy in his hands as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the interior of the aircraft. Without the autopilot, maintaining precise formation position became exponentially more difficult, requiring constant manual input from both pilots. Old Reliable began falling behind the formation. At 25,000 feet over enemy territory, there is no worse place for a bomber to be than alone. The German fighters recognized the wounded aircraft immediately, the way wolves recognize the weakened member of a herd. They began vectoring toward Old Reliable, breaking off from the main formation to focus on the isolated B-17. "Skipper, we've got company," Jennings called from the tail. His voice was calm but urgent. "Count 6 fighters forming up behind us. Make that 8. Jesus, make that 10. Morrison exchanged a glance with Kellerman. Both men knew what this meant. They were 300 miles inside Germany with 1 engine dead, hydraulics failing, and now separated from the protective umbrella of formation fire. The other bombers were pulling away, their contrails stretching toward the target while Old Reliable struggled to maintain altitude. "Crew, this is the pilot," Morrison announced over the intercom, his voice steady, despite the ice forming in his stomach.
We're not going to make it back to the formation.
We're going to maintain course. Gunners, conserve your ammunition and make every shot count. Navigator, give me a course for the shortest route back. We're going home."
Klein worked his calculations frantically, his pencil moving across charts that threatened to blow away in the wind, screaming through the numerous shell holes in the fuselage. "Pilot, navigator, come left to heading 270. That's the shortest route to the channel. 320 miles, 320 miles. It might as well have been 3,000. By 15 hours, 15 minutes after falling out of formation, Old Reliable was completely alone in the hostile sky. The main bomber stream had disappeared toward the horizon, leaving only the wounded B-17 and its hunters. The German fighters had taken their time organizing, knowing their prey was going nowhere. They formed up in a textbook attack pattern, some high, some level, some low, preparing to execute a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the fortress's defensive guns. Staff Sergeant Fisher at the right waist gun watched them come. He had been a gunner for 7 months, had faced fighter attacks on 18 previous missions, but he had never seen anything like this. The fighters were taking their time, positioning themselves with professional precision. These weren't green pilots making reckless attacks. These were veterans who knew exactly how to kill a B-17. "Here they come," Romano shouted from the top turret. The first wave hit from 12 o'clock high 3 Messerschmitt 109s diving out of the sun. Hendricks and Romano opened fire simultaneously, their combined 650 caliber guns creating a cone of fire that the lead 109 flew directly into. The German fighter disintegrated, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away in the slipstream, but the other two pressed their attack, their cannon shells punching through Old Reliable's nose, missing Hendricks by inches. Before the crew could celebrate the first kill, the second wave attacked from 3 o'clock level 4 Focke-Wulf 190s in a line abreast formation. Fisher and Pritchard swung their guns to meet them, the recoil of the 50s making the deck beneath their feet vibrate. One of the FW-190s broke off trailing smoke, but the others raked Old Reliable from nose to tail, their 20mm and 30mm cannons tearing enormous holes in the aluminum skin. The ball turret suddenly went silent. "Sullivan," Morrison called. No response. Lawson, the radio operator, crawled back to check on the ball turret gunner and found him slumped in his harness, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Cannon shell had penetrated the turret's thin armor. Sullivan was unconscious but alive. Lawson began applying a tourniquet in the cramped space, working by feel as much as sight. The third wave came from 6 o'clock Le Jennings' sector. The tail gunner had been waiting, his guns trained on the 319s climbing toward Old Reliable's vulnerable belly. He opened fire at maximum range, his tracers reaching out like deadly fingers. The lead 109 staggered as 50 caliber rounds punched through its engine cowling. Black smoke poured from the fighter as it rolled, inverted, and fell away. A 109 pressed its attack too aggressively. Jennings led it perfectly, squeezing the trigger in a long burst that he knew he shouldn't spare. The fighter flew directly into the stream of bullets. Its propeller disintegrated, followed by the engine cowling. The 109 nosed down sharply, and Jennings saw the pilot bail out, his parachute blossoming white against the gray clouds below. 6 kills. Morrison and Kellerman in the cockpit were fighting their own battle with the damaged aircraft. Number 2 engine was failing completely now, coughing black smoke and losing power by the second. Morrison feathered it before it could catch fire, leaving Old Reliable flying on only 2 engines, half its power gone. The bomber began losing altitude despite both pilots pushing the throttles to maximum, 24,000 feet, 23,000. The altimeter unwound steadily as Old Reliable sank toward the earth, and the German fighters followed, sensing the kill. "Captain, we've got maybe 5 minutes of ammunition left," Romano reported, his voice tight. "After that, we're defenseless." Morrison did the math in his head. They were still 280 miles from friendly territory. Their current speed with 2 engines, that was at least 90 minutes of flying time. The fighters would tear them apart long before then. Klein, the navigator, appeared in the cockpit, his face pale but determined. "Captain, I've been calculating. If we can get down to 15,000 feet and reduce power on the remaining engines, we might be able to glide most of the way to the channel. The winds are with us. That puts us right in the flak belt," Kellerman objected. "Every 88mm battery in Germany will have a shot at us." "We're dead either way if these fighters stay with us," Klein replied. Morrison made the decision. "We're going down." Crew braced for descent. "We're going to get below the fighter's optimal altitude and make a run for it." It was a desperate gamble. At lower altitudes, the German fighters would have better maneuverability, and the B-17 would be slower and less efficient. But staying at 25,000 feet, with 15 fighters circling, was guaranteed suicide. Morrison pushed the yoke forward, and Old Reliable's nose dropped. The bomber entered a shallow dive, trading altitude for distance, plunging toward the cloud deck below. The German fighters followed, sensing confusion or panic in the American crew. They didn't realize they were being lured into a trap. As Old Reliable descended through 20,000 feet, the air grew thicker, the oxygen richer. The crew disconnected from their portable bottles and breathed the frigid but more plentiful air. Their heads cleared, their reactions sharpened. And Romano, in the top turret, had an idea. "Captain, if you can level out at 12,000 feet just above those clouds, the fighters will be silhouetted against the bright sky above them. We'll have the sun advantage for the first time." Morrison understood immediately. For the entire battle, the German fighters had been attacking from above, using the sun to mask their approach. But if Old Reliable positioned itself just below the cloud deck, looking up, the fighters would be visible against the bright background while the bomber remained hidden in shadow. "Outstanding," Morrison said. "Gunners, when we level out, you'll have clear shots. Make them count." At 14:42 hours, 27 minutes into the running battle, Old Reliable leveled out at 12,000 feet, just skimming the top of a thick cloud deck. The bomber was now flying on 2 engines, riddled with hundreds of holes, with 2 gunners wounded and ammunition running critically low. The logical thing to do would have been to surrender, to bail out and accept captivity. But these men were not operating on logic. They're operating on something deeper: pride, duty, stubbornness, and a refusal to let their brothers down. The German fighters dove after Old Reliable, expecting to finish the crippled bomber at lower altitude. What they found instead was a wounded but far from helpless fortress that had just gained a crucial tactical advantage. The first FW-190 came screaming down from above, its pilot confident in an easy kill. He was silhouetted perfectly against the bright sky. Romano tracked him with cold precision, led him close to 300 yards, and opened fire. The convergence of his twin 50s at that range was devastating. The FW-190's canopy exploded, followed by its wing root. The fighter rolled inverted and plunged into the clouds, trailing fire and debris. 7 kills. A 109 tried a beam attack from the right side, but Fisher was ready. He had abandoned the left waist gun entirely now that Pritchard was wounded, focusing all his attention on the right side, where the attack was developing. He led the target perfectly, squeezing off a 3-second burst that caught the 109 in the engine. The fighter's propeller flew off, followed by the entire engine, and the airframe tumbled away. Kills. In the tail, Jennings was down to his last 50 rounds per gun. AFW-190 was positioning for another rear attack, but this time it made the mistake of approaching in a straight line, probably hoping to conserve ammunition. Jennings waited until the range closed to 200 yards, point-blank an aerial combatant, fired his remaining ammunition in one long, continuous burst. Splash 1. Jennings called, but there was no time for congratulations. 2 more fighters were already positioning for another attack. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes. Old Reliable had downed 3 German fighters, but the bomber was paying a terrible price. Number 2 engine was now running rough, hit by shell fragments from a near miss. The oxygen system was leaking from multiple punctures, forcing the crew to switch to portable bottles. The intercom was cutting in and out. The hydraulic fluid was gone, and still the fighters kept coming. Kellerman, the co-pilot, was bleeding from a scalp wound where a piece of shrapnel had creased his skull. He stayed at his position, maintaining control inputs, while Morrison wrestled with the damaged aircraft. "We're not going to make it 300 miles, Kellerman said quietly on the private intercom channel. "We need to consider bailing out." Morrison shook his head. "Not yet. Not while we're still flying." At 14:28 hours, 14 minutes into the running battle, the situation deteriorated further. 5 more German fighters joined the attack, fresh pilots with full ammunition loads. Old Reliable now faced 15 enemy aircraft, all focused on destroying the lone bomber. The gunners were running low on ammunition, their barrels were overheating, and the enemy seemed endless. Fisher watched another wave forming up and felt something he had never experienced in combat before. Fear? Exactly, but a cold certainty that this was the end. There was no way 10 men and a damaged bomber could hold off 15 fighters indefinitely. It was mathematics, simple and brutal. But Harold Fisher had underestimated the men around him, and he had underestimated the machine beneath his feet. The next attack came from everywhere at once. It was a tactic the German pilots had perfected through bitter experience, the overwhelming assault that would saturate the bomber's defensive fire and guarantee penetration. 6 fighters attacked from different vectors simultaneously, 2 from 12 o'clock high, 2 from 3 o'clock level, 1 from 6 o'clock low, and 1 making a vertical climb toward the bomber's belly. The noise was apocalyptic. Every gun on Old Reliable was firing, the overlapping roar of the 50 calibers creating a physical vibration that shook the entire aircraft. Brass shell casings by the thousands tumbled through the bomber, rolling underfoot, piling up in corners. The smell of cordite was overwhelming, mixing with the stench of hydraulic fluid, blood, and fear. Romano in the top turret swung his guns through impossibly fast arcs, tracking targets, firing, moving to the next threat. His hands moved with mechanical precision, even as his mind screamed at the impossibility of what he was attempting. 1 man, 2 guns, trying to hold off 6 directions of attack. A 20mm cannon shell exploded against the top turret's armor, right next to Romano's head. The concussion left his ears ringing, but his hands never left the guns. He poured fire into a FW-190 making a beam attack, saw his tracers converge on the fighter's cockpit, watched it roll away vertically out of control. For kills. In the nose, Hendricks was fighting his own desperate battle. 2 109s were making simultaneous head-on passes, their closing speed so fast that he had barely 2 seconds to engage each target. He fired at the one on the right, saw strikes on its wing route, then swung left and fired again. The second 109's cannon sparkled. Hendricks felt the impact as shells punched through the plexiglass nose, filling the compartment with freezing wind and flying debris. A shell fragment caught him in the thigh. The pain was instant and overwhelming, but he kept his hands on the guns, kept firing even as blood soaked his electrically heated pants. The 109 flashed past so close that he could see the victory markings painted on its fuselage. This pilot had killed bombers before. Fisher and Pritchard at the waist guns were firing continuously now, their sectors overlapping as fighters attacked from both sides. AFW 190 came in at 4 o'clock, its guns blazing. Pritchard's stream of tracers caught it in the engine, and the fighter nosed down hard, streaming fire. But another immediately took its place, and another after that. Pritchard suddenly cried out and staggered backward from his gun. Fisher glanced over and saw his fellow gunner clutching his arm, blood pumping between his fingers. "I'm hit." Pritchard shouted over the intercom, "Gun's yours." Fisher now had to cover both waist positions. He ran between the two guns, firing bursts from one side, then racing across the fuselage to fire from the other. His lungs burned in the thin air, and the portable oxygen bottle on his belt was running low, but he kept moving, kept firing. AFW 190 exploded under his guns, 5 kills for Old Reliable. In the tail, Jennings was fighting the loneliest battle of all. Separated from his crewmates by 50 feet of fuselage, he faced 3 fighters that had positioned themselves directly behind the bomber, knowing the tail gunner was their only threat from this angle. They took turns making attacks, one fighter distracting him while the others closed in. Jennings had developed a rhythm fire. Traverse, fire, traverse. Never stay on one target too long. Keep them all worried. Keep them all defensive. His ammunition counters were dropping toward empty, but he forced himself to aim carefully, to make every burst count. The effect was catastrophic for the German pilot. 50 caliber rounds, each half an inch in diameter and weighing nearly 2 ounces, struck the FW-190 at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. The fighter's tail section disintegrated. The aircraft pitched straight up, stalled, and fell away spinning. 9 kills. Jennings's guns clicked empty. Tail gunner is Winchester, Jennings reported, using the code word for out of ammunition. "I'm done." But his sacrifice had bought precious minutes. Old Reliable was now 150 miles inside Germany, still being pursued by 6 remaining fighters, but the odds had shifted. The German pilots were growing cautious, having watched 9 of their comrades go down. These survivors were veterans, and veterans knew when to break off before the kill became mutual. Morrison sensed the change in the enemy's tactics. Attacks were less aggressive now, more probing. The German pilots were staying at range, trying to force Old Reliable into mistakes rather than pressing home attacks. They were running low on ammunition too, and fuel was becoming a concern. "Navigator, how far to friendly territory?" Morrison asked. Klein checked his calculations. 140 miles to the front lines. 90 miles to confirmed Allied air cover. 90 miles. At their current speed, that was another 40 minutes. Could they last 40 more minutes? At 14:55 hours, the answer became clear. 4 of the 6 remaining German fighters broke off and turned east, heading back to their bases. They had expended their ammunition, and their fuel margins were critical. Only 2 fighters remained at FW-190 and a 19, probably flight leaders, who had more fuel and ammunition reserves. But even these 2 were no longer pressing attacks. They circled at a distance, occasionally making half-hearted passes that the remaining guns on Old Reliable easily discouraged. They were waiting for something. "Captain, I've got multiple bogeys on radar," Lawson called from his radio position. He had rigged a damaged radar set and coaxed it back to life. Coming from the west. Could be ours, could be theirs. Every man on the bomber held his breath. If those were German fighters coming to relieve the 2 that were still attacking, Old Reliable was finished. The crew had almost no ammunition left. 2 engines were dead. The hydraulics were nearly gone, and everyone was beyond exhaustion. The dots on Lawson's makeshift radar screen grew closer, 8 of them flying fast at 12,000 feet. Then Kellerman saw them first, not on radar, but through the cockpit window. 8 aircraft, but not the angular, aggressive lines of German fighters. These were different. These were P-51 Mustangs, the long-range fighters that were beginning to turn the tide of the air war over Europe. Friendlies. Kellerman shouted, "We've got little friends." The 2 remaining German fighters saw them at the same moment and immediately broke off, diving for the cloud deck and disappearing. They wanted no part of P-51s in a fair fight. The lead Mustang pulled alongside Old Reliable, and Morrison could see the pilot looking over at the damaged bomber. The entire left side of the B-17 was torn to shreds. The number 3 engine was feathered. The number 2 engine was trailing smoke, and there were visible holes in the fuselage large enough to throw a basketball through. The aircraft was still flying, was itself a miracle. The P-51 pilot gave a thumbs up and waggled his wings, the signal that he and his flight would escort Old Reliable home. Then the Mustangs spread out in a defensive formation around the bomber, and for the first time in 43 minutes, the crew of Old Reliable allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive. "Crew, this is the pilot," Morrison announced, and his voice was hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. "We're going home." The next hour was a test of endurance rather than combat. Old Reliable continued losing altitude as Morrison and Kellerman babied the two remaining engines. They crossed the front lines at 8,000 feet, still descending, and finally reached the English Channel at 5,000 feet. The bomber was disintegrating around them. Pieces of metal were tearing loose in the slipstream. The number 1 engine was running so rough that Morrison expected it to seize at any moment. The flight controls were barely responding, but Old Reliable kept flying, kept grinding forward toward England. They crossed the English coast at 15:45 hours, 3 hours and 15 minutes after takeoff. Ridgewell Airfield was 40 miles inland. Morrison requested an emergency straighten approach, and the tower cleared all other traffic. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway. At 16:03 hours, with the landing gear only partially extended because the hydraulics were completely gone, with no flaps because the controls were shot away, with both pilots standing on the rudder pedals to maintain directional control, Old Reliable touched down at Ridgewell. The landing was hard. Morrison had no choice but to drop the bomber onto the runway, and the half-extended landing gear collapsed immediately. The B-17 skidded down the runway on its belly, throwing sparks and pieces of aluminum, finally coming to rest just short of the grass overrun. The crew evacuated through every available opening. Hendricks, Pritchard, and Sullivan were immediately loaded onto ambulances. The rest of the crew stood on the grass next to their aircraft and simply stared at it. Old Reliable looked like it had flown through a tornado made of razor blades. The ground crew counted over 500 individual holes in the airframe. 3 engines were damaged beyond repair. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The electrical system was barely functional. Half the radio equipment was shot out. The oxygen system was in tatters. There were bloodstains on the deck inside, and yet it had brought them home. The debriefing took 3 hours. Intelligence officers listened in stunned silence as the crew recounted the battle. 9 confirmed kills. It's possibly more damaged aircraft that didn't make it home. 43 minutes of continuous combat against 15 enemy fighters, all while flying a damaged aircraft with 2 engines and half a crew. The intelligence officers initially didn't believe it. They thought the crew was exaggerating, confused by the chaos of combat. But when the gun camera footage was developed, it told an even more dramatic story than the crew had described. Every kill was verified. The precision of the defensive fire was extraordinary. The coordination between gunners was textbook perfect. Word of the mission spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Captain Morrison and his crew had accomplished something that most fighter pilots would consider impossible, defeating a numerically superior enemy force. While flying a damaged bomber, it was a triumph of skill, courage, and sheer determination. The awards came quickly. Captain Robert Morrison received the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor for his leadership and airmanship. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano in the top turret received the Silver Star for his 3 confirmed kills and his tactical innovation in using the cloud deck for defensive advantage. Staff Sergeant William Jennings, the tail gunner, received the Silver Star for his 3 kills and his sacrifice in expending his remaining ammunition to protect the crew. Staff Sergeant Harold Fisher received the Distinguished Flying Cross for manning 2 gun positions simultaneously while wounded. The entire crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and Old Reliable itself became famous throughout the 8th Air Force. Mechanics worked around the clock to rebuild the bomber, placing 3 engines, thousands of feet of hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and structural components. The aircraft flew again 6 weeks later, bearing fresh paint and over 500 patch plates riveted to its skin. It's a testament to the day it refused to die. But perhaps the most significant impact of the mission was on American bomber crews throughout the theater. For months, they had been told that German fighters were invincible, that survival was mostly luck, that there was nothing a crew could do against determined attacks. Old Reliable's crew proved that wrong. They demonstrated that with skill, coordination, and refusal to surrender, even impossible odds could be overcome. Flight training schools began using the mission as a case study. The tactical innovation of using altitude and cloud cover to gain sun advantage became standard doctrine. Gunners were trained to the higher standard that Romano, Jennings, and Fisher had demonstrated. The belief spread through the bomber force that survival wasn't just luck, it was something you could fight for. The human cost of the mission was significant but survivable. Lieutenant Hendricks spent 3 weeks in hospital recovering from his leg wound, but returned to flying duties. Sergeant Pritchard's arm wound was more serious, and he was eventually reassigned to non-combat duties. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's shoulder wound ended his combat career, though he recovered fully. The psychological impact on the crew was profound. They had faced death and won, but the memory of those 43 minutes never left them. In later interviews, conducted years after the war, every surviving crew member could still recall specific details: the sound of the guns, the smell of the cordite, the sight of German fighters exploding, the sensation of the bomber shuddering under repeated hits. Captain Morrison flew 10 more missions before completing his tours and returning to the United States. He never spoke publicly about the February 20th mission, considering it simply his job, but his fellow pilots knew. They would point him out to newcomers. That's Morrison, is the one who survived 15 fighters with a crippled plane. Technical Sergeant Romano was offered a battlefield commission but declined, preferring to remain with the enlisted crew. He completed 45 missions, 20 more than required, before being ordered to return home. After the war, he became a flight instructor, passing on the lessons learned in that desperate fight at 12,000 feet. Staff Sergeant Jennings, the tail gunner, was credited with 3 confirmed kills that day, bringing his total to 5. He was offered promotion and reassignment to a training squadron, but he refused to leave his crew. He flew with Morrison until the end of Morrison's tour, then transferred to another crew and continued flying missions until WWII. The fate of the German pilots who attacked Old Reliable remains mostly unknown. Records suggest that 5 of the 9 downed fighters resulted in pilot deaths, 3 killed in their aircraft, 2 killed when their parachutes failed to open. 4 German pilots survived to be captured by advancing Allied forces in the following months. They confirmed in interrogation that the attack on the lone B-17 was intended to be a quick kill, a morale boost for the Jagdschwader. Instead, it had become a costly defeat that shook the confidence of the entire fighter group. Old Reliable survived the war. The bomber flew 72 combat missions, suffered major damage on 6 occasions, and brought its crew home every single time. After WWII, it was flown back to the United States and placed in storage. In 1947, the aircraft was scrapped, its aluminum melted down and reformed into civilian products. No trace of the aircraft remains except photographs and official records. But the legacy of that February day in 1944 lives on. The mission is still studied at Air Force academies as an example of successful defensive tactics. The crew's refusal to surrender despite impossible odds is held up as the standard for military bearing under fire. And somewhere in the memories of the men who flew that day, those still living and those long past, exists the absolute certainty that they achieved something extraordinary. They were 10 men in a damaged aircraft, facing 15 enemy fighters at the edge of the breathable atmosphere, and they won. It's not through luck, not through overwhelming force, but through skill, determination, and an absolute refusal to let each other down. That is the story of Old Reliable. That is the story of what happened when a lone B-17 met 15 fighters at 25,000 feet. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Stories of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, finding within themselves reserves of courage and skill they never knew existed. The skies over Europe in 1944 were filled with such moments, individual acts of heroism that occurred far from cameras or witnesses, known only to the men who lived them. Captain Morrison and his crew never considered themselves heroes. They were simply doing their jobs, protecting each other, and trying to get home. But in doing so, they set a standard that inspired thousands of other bomber crews who faced the same impossible odds in the months that followed. The air war over Nazi Germany was won by men like these, not generals or admirals. 20-year-old gunners standing at open windows in the frozen stratosphere, fighting with everything they had because their brothers were counting on them. Their story deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored. Their example deserves to be passed on to future generations who will face their own impossible. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. It continued to nudge Claude along. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Like this video if you want to see more stories of courage and survival from the Second World War, and remember, behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every dry historical fact, there are stories like this one. Stories of real men facing real danger, making real sacrifices for causes larger than themselves. This is World War II Records, keeping their memory alive.